They say a joke can break the ice, but it can also ruin a whole life. I learned that the hard way. It should have been just another stupid joke, the kind that happens when you want to lighten the mood in the middle of a fight, to hide the pain behind laughter. "You're not as cool as my lover." I grinned, but there was something different in his eyes. Something cold, something final. And that's when I realized, this wasn't going to be just another fight. This would be the end of everything. I couldn't even imagine how quickly everything would fall apart. Just a moment ago, we were just a family, me and my husband, with our history and shared understanding. And just moments later, I was standing on the edge of destruction, watching what I was creating crumble. I was joking, yes. But that joke wasn't about him. It was about me, about what I'd done, about what I'd destroyed in our lives. I never thought it would end this way. But here I am, with my life ruined, my marriage ruined, my dreams shattered. Everything seemed normal in the evening. The sun was setting, and long shadows stretched across the room as a reminder of how quickly time was passing. My husband, Mikhail, was sitting on the couch reading a book. It was a familiar silence that we have come to accept as the norm. But underneath that silence, I could feel the tension, something I could no longer ignore. I'd been feeling it for months. That restless itch in my head, those doubts that our marriage was hanging by a thread. But I couldn't admit it to myself. It was easier to pretend everything was fine than to face the unpleasant truth. After all, I was a good wife, wasn't I? I cooked, cleaned, greeted him with a smile when he came home. What more do you need? But there was another side of me that was beginning to stir restlessly. Part of me longed for something more, something I found in the arms of another man. My infidelity with Alexei started innocently enough, a few innocuous texts that were just an attempt to distract myself from the gray of everyday life. But soon it became something more. Something I couldn't stop. Something I didn't want to stop. Mikhail didn't know. He was a good man, a devoted husband, and he trusted me. That trust, however, had become a cage I'd locked myself into, weaving a web of lies and deceit. I wanted to come clean, I wanted to tell him, but every time I thought about revealing the truth, I stopped myself. How could I tell him that? How could I ruin the life we were building together? So I kept quiet, letting the infidelity develop in the shadows, in secret, hiding it from the man who loved me, but at some point, it became impossible for me to keep quiet. The lie was becoming too heavy. I could feel it squeezing me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to collapse. And then, one day, it did. "Mikhail," I began, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Can I tell you something?" He looked up from his book, his face changed, and there was worry in it. "Sure." "Is something wrong?" I hesitated, not knowing how to begin. How to admit that I'd betrayed him. How to tell him I wasn't the woman he thought I was. I started, but then my phone rang, a notification from Alexei. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly grabbed my phone and looked at the screen. It was Alexei. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. "Is everything okay?" Mikhail asked, his voice becoming wary. I forced myself to smile, trying to hide my growing anxiety. "Yeah, it's just a text from work. I shouldn't have checked it. I shouldn't have responded. But I did." And by doing so, I'd already signed my sentence. As soon as I typed a reply, Michael, without taking his eyes off me, noticed something alarming in my behavior. "What was that?" His voice turned cold. "Nothing." I hastily placed the phone on the table, but it was too late. A shadow of doubt slipped into his eyes, and I felt the chasm between us begin to grow. That night was unbearable. We hardly spoke at all. When we did, it was in a detached, restrained way. I tried to banish thoughts of Alexei, but they wouldn't leave me. I couldn't get rid of the shadow that now hung over our relationship. In the morning, looking at myself in the mirror, I realized that I could no longer recognize myself as the woman I used to be. How had I become this? The woman who betrayed me? A woman who didn't seem to know what honesty and loyalty were. I promised myself that it would stop. But every time I tried to do so, I found myself back in this game again. Over and over again, and then, that day, it happened. It flared up. It flared up in all seriousness. "You're not as cool as my lover," I said with a smirk, without thinking. I didn't think I'd say that out loud. But when I looked at Michael, there was something cold in his eyes. Something definitive. "You've had your say," he replied quietly, and his voice was icy. "This is your final joke. Divorce." His words struck like a whip. I didn't know what to say back. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't believe that all my fears had become reality. Mikhail stood up without saying a word and headed for the door. I couldn't move, as if my feet were chained to the floor. With every second his figure became more distant and alien. I wanted to say something, to try to justify myself, but the word stuck in my throat. Divorce. The word echoed in my head. Instead of stopping it, I stayed silent. That silence was primarily about me, about the fact that I was so deep into this deception that I couldn't even find the strength to say anything in response. I'd always believed that sincerity was important in relationships, that even in the most difficult situations you should tell the truth, but now I stood in front of him like a traitor, unable to even apologize. How many times I thought I was ready to talk to him about my betrayal, to tell him about my sin. But each time something held me back, fear of destroying everything we'd built, or maybe I was afraid I wouldn't be able to go back if I crossed that line. Michael opened the door, and before he stepped out, he dropped another phrase that pierced me to the bone. "I can't live with you anymore, knowing that you betrayed me." His words, simple, but with such desperation, cut me off from reality. I stood as if in a fog, unable to move or do anything. My entire life in front of me turned into scraps of memories that never seemed to come true. How did I get to this point? Everything seemed to be normal. Remembering the ordinariness is like looking at a photograph. My husband was always caring and attentive. He loved me. And even in recent years, when we began to talk less and less, when voids began to form between us, I continued to pretend that everything was fine. But something had been wrong inside me for a long time. I sat on the couch and buried myself in my thoughts, trying to remember when this tragedy had started. And then I was overcome by flashbacks, not vivid moments, but a mosaic that filled my soul with what I'd been trying to suppress for so long. That night when I first met Alexei seemed so simple. We met by chance. And I didn't think it would go this far. He was as attentive and caring as I hadn't seen a man in a long time. He listened to me like Mikhail couldn't, and I loved it. Alexei seemed more than just a man to spend time with. He seemed like salvation. I often fooled myself into thinking it was just fun, that it didn't matter. I thought I could control the situation, that I wouldn't betray Mikhail, that it would all be just a passing story that would soon be over. But every day, I felt more and more like Alexei was becoming an important part of my life. We started seeing each other more often, and more often I forgot that I had a husband, that I had promised to be faithful. I started looking for meetings with Alex, finding excuses to justify his appearance in my life. I started looking for a way to get away from Michael and into someone else's arms. It all seemed so insignificant, so harmless. But now I realize how wrong I was. All this was a deadly poisoning that was slowly but surely destroying my marriage. Every day I became more and more a stranger to Michael. His feelings were becoming deafened, while mine, on the contrary, were blossoming into something that was new and exciting to me. Alexei was the one who filled me with emotions I had long forgotten. Mikhail felt it too, but he was too proud to admit it. He'd always believed that family should come first, and the fact that I was starting to drift apart alarmed him. But, like me, he preferred to ignore what was really going on. We were both living in this quagmire, each in our own way, but both consumed by a kind of involuntary alienation. My heart clenched as I remembered our last conversation before everything fell apart. Mikhail had said to me, "I feel like you're pulling away from me. But I'm willing to fight. I don't want us to fall apart." And I, instead of answering him honestly, said, "It's okay, I'm just tired, it'll pass." I had deceived him in that moment, and that little deception was probably what led to the disaster. I took a deep breath, feeling my heart clench with pain and shame. It was hard for me to believe that everything had fallen apart so easily. In one night, in one mistake. The divorce. It was all I could think about. It was the end. I looked up from my phone, which had been on the table the whole time, and saw a new message from Alexei. We hadn't seen each other in a few days, and he was asking when I was coming over. I didn't know what to feel anymore. My life seemed ruined, but at the same time I felt how hard it was to break the habit, as if I was no longer able to give up what had brought me to this state. But here, in this empty house, I realized that no other man could replace what I had lost. Mikhail was my husband. And even if I wasn't worthy of him, I still loved him. The time that stretched after his words seemed like an eternity. All I did was sit on that couch as if lost, unable to move. His words cut me like a razor, and I couldn't recover from them. Divorce. The word kept running through my head like a refrain, keeping me on my toes. I never thought I could get to this point. I'd spent so many years building my life with him, with Michael. And now, because of my own weakness, I've lost everything. Lost something I couldn't get back, even if I wanted to. I looked around the room, trying to find something to soothe my soul. But there wasn't. The whole environment seemed foreign to me. This house that had once been harmonious now seemed empty and lifeless. We had lived so long in this world, full of habits and routine. But it was crumbling like a house of cards, and I could not rebuild it. I grabbed my phone then, figuring it would at least be a distraction. I glanced at the screen, but all I saw was a message from Alexei, "Don't you miss me? When will I see you?" That was it. In that moment, I realized that I had to decide something. My phone became like my only connection to reality, which was now distant from everything that was going on with Mikhail. As if out of inertia, I answered him, "I miss you. I can't wait for you to come." The text flew away, and as soon as I let go of that impulse, it became even heavier on my soul. I felt an ache squeeze in my chest, like someone was tearing me apart. It didn't feel right. But I couldn't stop anymore. Everything I was doing to Alex was the result of my own weakness. I'd sought comfort in his arms, in his words, and now it was defining me in some way, but no matter how much I tried to justify myself, I knew that I was actually the one who had ruined my life. I could have been honest with Michael, could have stopped at that moment when everything was still possible. But now it was all too late. I looked at my phone again, seeing another message from Alexei. There was nothing new in it, just another request to meet, about how we could spend time together. But I felt that at that moment I needed something more. I needed to answer myself the question of what I wanted next. I decided that I would leave. I would go away for a few days to think things over. I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer, waiting for Michael to come out and tell me that divorce was inevitable. I was ready to withdraw, to shut myself away, to go somewhere else, to forget everything that had happened for a while. Mikhail never came back. And I hoped he wouldn't come back himself. I packed quickly, not thinking about the consequences. I took my bag off the shelf and started packing, not knowing where I was going, but deciding that I had to leave this house. My eyes fell on an old photo of Mikhail and me sitting happily on the beach, holding hands. I sighed, but immediately looked away. Thoughts swirled in my head, and I realized that I just couldn't stay here in this house anymore. I sent another text to Alexei, "I'm on my way. Can you meet me in a couple hours?" The reply came almost immediately, "Sure. I'll be waiting." I felt a wave of relief come over me, but along with it came a tremendous amount of anxiety. What was I going to do? How could I do this to the man who had been by my side for so many years? But now, in this situation, I couldn't stop now. The only thing that was important was to get away from all this as soon as possible. Half an hour later, I left the house. Mikhail was gone, and I didn't feel relieved about it. On the contrary, I felt even heavier. We had never left each other like this before. This was the first time. And it was scary. I paced down the street, feeling the distance between me and the world I'd destroyed growing with each step. I got into a cab and asked the driver to take me to the hotel where I'd met Alexei a few months ago. It was a familiar place, and I knew that there I would be able to get rid of the thoughts that plagued me, at least for a few hours. Along the way, I thought about what had happened. All those years I had spent with Mikhail seemed so distant and foreign. I tried to remember when exactly this void had appeared in my life that I had tried to fill with other people and experiences. I tried to make sense of myself, to understand what had caused my behavior and why I had done that to him. Finally, the cab stopped, and I got out. I felt my breathing hitch, the tension stiffening my body. It was like running away. An escape from responsibility. Running from my own decisions that I couldn't turn back. When I entered the room, Alexei was already there. He stood up when he saw me and walked over silently. I felt his arms wrap around me. And in that moment I felt a little better. But along with that came more emptiness. I felt myself losing more and more of myself, and that what had seemed like salvation was actually becoming part of the abyss into which I had plunged myself. When I got to the hotel room, everything felt so empty that I felt the space begin to shrink around me. Alexei sat on the couch, as confident as ever, and looked at me. But his gaze kept me on my toes. It wasn't the same as before, when his eyes were burning with interest and desire. Now there was a shadow of disappointment in them. He sensed that something was broken in me. And I knew it. I took off my jacket and sat down across from him, trying to find some sort of foothold to regain some of my confidence. But instead, all I could feel was everything falling apart in front of me. Every step I took was now harder and harder. "Are you okay?" Alexei asked, making no attempt to move closer to me. His voice was quiet, but strained. He already knew I wasn't okay, and the question sounded more like a statement of fact. I remained silent. The words weren't coming. All I could do was close my eyes and try not to think. But the thoughts came and wouldn't let go. Every memory of Mikhail, his look, his words, "I can't live with you anymore," were like blows. I couldn't forget the way he tried to hold back his pain. He still loved me, and I knew it, but I had betrayed him. How many times I thought it could have been prevented. If only I had stopped in time, if I hadn't started hiding from him, if I hadn't allowed myself those weaknesses, maybe things would have been different. But now I was standing on the edge, and I was afraid to look down, because I knew that this fall would be unstoppable. Alexei noticed my silence and apparently realized that I was in no condition to speak. He got up from the couch and walked over to me, kneeling down in front of me. It was a gesture I hadn't expected, a gesture that seemed so sincere and real. He placed his hands on my lap again, trying to make contact on my part. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" he asked. But there was no longer the same confidence in his voice as before. There was uncertainty, and maybe even fear in it. I could see that he felt it too. Our relationship wouldn't be the same. I opened my eyes and looked at him. We were so close, yet so distant at the same time. I felt my words stuck somewhere inside me, as if they couldn't get out. I couldn't tell him the truth. It wasn't just the story of how I had betrayed Michael. It was much deeper than that. I had betrayed myself, lost my morals, my power, and my trust. And maybe I was scared to admit that I had become a person I wasn't proud of. I don't know what to do, Alexei. I can't explain it. I finally squeezed it out of me. He sat silently, and there was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. He knew there was a conflict going on inside me. He knew I was out of control. And maybe I was ready to admit it, but not in front of him. "Do you want to leave him?" he asked quietly, touching my hands again. I felt his fingers, and for a moment I thought there was some power in that very touch, some possibility of forgetting everything for a moment. But then I realized that this, too, was a deception. "I don't know," I answered, and it was true. I couldn't answer myself what was right. I couldn't answer the question of how to get back what I had lost. The silence in the room was deafening. We sat there, and it was as if time had stopped. I didn't know what to do next. Alexei didn't rush me for an answer either. He was there for me, but that didn't give me any comfort either. He was as lost as I was because he knew this relationship couldn't be fulfilling. I couldn't be with him knowing that I couldn't go back to Michael. My thoughts went back to Michael. To what was. To what I had destroyed. My inner world now resembled the broken walls of the house I had tried to build. There was a void everywhere, and no man could fill it. Alexei stood up and walked over to the window. He didn't say a word, but I felt him leaving me alone, giving me time. Time to think. Time that I needed, but that I couldn't afford. I couldn't procrastinate any longer. I realized that eventually I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay in this world of lies any longer, this world I had created myself. When he came back to me, his face was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes that I couldn't understand. "You know what you need to do," he said, and I realized that he wasn't just talking about divorcing Michael, but about me finally realizing who I was. I got up off the couch and looked at him. This was the moment when I had to make up my mind. I had to choose what was next in my life, who I would be with, and perhaps most importantly, who I would be, but for now, I couldn't answer that question. It had been a few days since I had left home, and I was still in that hotel room. My body had already gotten used to the isolation, but my head couldn't seem to find peace. Time flowed slowly and every hour was like torture. I couldn't get rid of the thought of Mikhail, of his words, of how everything had broken in an instant. I couldn't stop thinking about how everything I had once loved was now turning to ash. Alexei never came. He texted me, called me, but I didn't answer. Every day his persistence became more and more annoying, and I, in turn, was losing control of myself. I knew I couldn't go back to Michael, couldn't be near him again after betraying him, but I wasn't ready to go any further. I couldn't believe that my life had turned into such a nightmare that there was no turning back. When I finally decided to confront Alexei, my hands were shaking. I didn't know what I would say to him, I didn't know how I would feel when I saw him. I couldn't answer the question that plagued me. Did I want to be with him, or did I need time to realize what I really wanted out of life? He met me at a cafe, one of those places where we often spent time before. Alexei was sitting by the window, and as soon as I walked in, his eyes immediately found me. There was something insistent in his gaze, but also patient. He knew I hadn't come for him. But perhaps he was still hopeful. I walked over to the table, sat down across from him, and he immediately handed me a cup of coffee, as usual. I thanked him, but the taste of the coffee seemed unpleasant. I couldn't concentrate on the little things, even the familiar ones. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" he asked, his voice soft, but I could sense the anticipation in it. I sighed and lowered my gaze, unable to look him in the eye. I couldn't just answer like that. I couldn't just admit that I'd lost myself, that I didn't know what to do, that I was just trying to find comfort in him instead of love. "I don't know." My words sounded like an admission of defeat. "You don't have to answer that. But you need to sort yourself out before you make a decision about what comes next." Alexei spoke calmly, but I could feel his inner struggle reflected in his words, too. The silence became heavy as a stone. I looked out the window, but I couldn't concentrate on what was happening behind the glass. My thoughts kept returning to Mikhail. I thought about his face, about how hurt he'd been when he found out about my cheating. It was too painful. It was impossible to get over, and I knew I couldn't go back to the way things used to be. I was no longer the woman he loved. I had ruined everything. And now what was left? Build something new with Alexei? Or try to get it back with Mikhail? "You know you can't go on like this," Alexei said, his voice now sounding slightly irritated. "You need to make up your mind. I understand how you feel. But you can't keep running between us. You have to be honest with yourself." To him. Both of us. I met his gaze, and in his eyes I saw not only disappointment, but something more, something I couldn't exactly understand. He wasn't my salvation, but he was there for me. He was the one I was trying to find a way out with. But I couldn't trust that. I couldn't convince myself that there was something real between us that wasn't ruined by what I'd done. "I can't just make up my mind," I said, answering his question. "I don't know what to do. All I know is that I can't go back to him. And that I can't be with you, no matter how much you want me. I can't be with you because you're not what I need." There was a flicker of understanding in his eyes, but also bitterness. He knew our relationship couldn't be fulfilling. He knew I wasn't ready to start something new with him because I was broken. And even though I realized it, it was impossible for me to let him go, no matter how much I wanted to. He drank his coffee in silence and set the cup aside. You won't be happy if you keep living like this. You can't get over him, and you can't get over yourself, because you're not who you used to be. I couldn't argue with him. He's right. But what was I supposed to do now? I was confused, broken, lost. Not knowing where to go, I made a decision that seemed to be the only way out. I need time, Alexei. I need time to figure out what I want, what I'm going to do. He nodded silently, no judgment or hope in his gaze. Just understanding. And maybe that was the hardest part, his calmness. I felt my strength draining away again. As I stood up and headed for the exit, I felt the sky overhead grow heavy. I couldn't continue living in this hell, in this gap between past and present. But I didn't know how to get out of this situation, how to find myself. I was walking down the street with only one thought ringing in my head: I need to figure myself out. But what did I find when I turned around? I had lost so much that I couldn't get back. And all that was left was to find a way to find myself again. Several months had passed since the day I made the decision to distance myself from Alexei, and even more time had passed since I'd left Michael. Life seemed to be moving along, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything that was happening was just an illusion. Every day became similar to the previous one. And not a single little thing brought joy. My soul was in a void and my memory was a prisoner of memories. I tried to return to normal life as if nothing had happened. I worked, went out with friends, but all these moments didn't seem real to me. I kept thinking about what I had lost, and all attempts to move on, deceiving myself, were fruitless. But then, one day, I ran into him, Michael. I was walking down the street that day, absorbed in my thoughts, when I saw him. He was standing outside the store, his face as familiar, as dear, but still changed. He was older, a little tired, but the look he gave me was the same as it had been back then, in the days we'd been together. He didn't notice me right away, but I saw him first. Immediately I froze, not knowing what to do. My steps slowed, and my heart quickened its rhythm. It took a few seconds before he turned and noticed me. I felt my body tense up. We stood across from each other, like two people who had once been close, but were now complete strangers. Though there were no words between us, I felt our shared history squeeze the air like an intolerable weight. "Hello," he said, his voice quiet but strong. He didn't rush over, didn't try to touch like he had before. He stood at a distance, as if there were an invisible barrier between us. I stood there, not knowing what to say. The words wouldn't come, and something inside me was crumbling. All those feelings I'd tried to hide came back with renewed force. I looked at him and couldn't believe he was standing here, next to me, after everything that had happened. "How are you?" he asked, holding no reproach. He was different, so calm and even a little detached. I didn't know what had become of him over the months, and I didn't know what had become of me. I don't know," I answered, feeling the words stick in my throat. My soul was tearing up, but I couldn't express it. He looked at me again, and I saw his eyes soften. With every look he gave me, I could feel it all coming back. How I was becoming the woman I once was with him again. But it didn't matter anymore. We'd both changed. "You look different," Mikhail said, and there was something warm in his voice that I hadn't heard in a long time. But it couldn't bring back what was. I nodded, trying to gather my thoughts. We were both silent, and those few minutes became something impossible, unbearable. I couldn't make the first move, couldn't find the strength to speak, and then, turning to me again, he said, "Do you want to talk? I realize it's not that simple. I didn't expect you to come back." These words hurt me deeply. I didn't expect myself to come back. I didn't think I could stand here, in front of him, and it would all be so difficult, so painful. I don't know, I struggled to look up. "I'm trying to understand what happened. But it's hard for me," Mikhail nodded silently. He seemed to realize that I wasn't ready to talk. But I knew that this was the conversation I needed to have. I knew I had to ask him how he felt, what he thought of me. "I thought you'd never come back," he said quietly, but there was regret in his words. "You were gone and I didn't know what to do." I felt the weight fall on my shoulders again. I couldn't hide my guilt, couldn't hide what I'd done. I had betrayed him, betrayed myself. But I still stood in front of him because I knew that right now I was the only one who could return the answer I hadn't given myself. I didn't think I would come back, I uttered, and the words became like a sentence to me. I thought it was over. Mikhail looked at me, and I saw something new in his eyes, not rage, not resentment, but quiet pain. He wasn't the same man he'd been before. He was broken, but I knew it wasn't his weakness. It was his pain, his way of getting over everything I'd done. We were silent, but that silence wasn't heavy, it was filled with understanding. He knew I couldn't go back, that I couldn't apologize for what I'd done. But he remained the man who had once loved me, and that was the worst part. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to leave so I wouldn't have to continue this painful communication, but I couldn't.